good evening on this, the first full day of the Paul Manafort era. After dismissing campaign manager Corey Lewandowski yesterday, today, Donald J. Trump and his revamping general election strategy were tested immediately. Hillary Clinton gave a scathing speech in swing state Ohio about the economy, but the speech was really a lot about Trump's business record and his past statements. MSNBC, CNN, and Fox all took her remarks live. These were her sharpest attacks today in Columbus.
Liberals and conservatives say Trump's ideas would be disastrous. The Chamber of Commerce and labor unions, Mitt Romney and Elizabeth Warren, economists on the right and the left and the center all agree Trump would throw us back into recession. He says women will start making equal pay as soon as we do as good a job as men. He calls himself the king of debt. And his tax plan sure lives up to that name. Alexander Hamilton would be rolling in his grave. He's written a lot of books about business. They all seem to end at chapter 11. Is this who you want to lead us in an emergency? Someone thin-skinned and quick to anger who'd likely be on Twitter attacking reporters or bringing the whole regulatory system down on his critics when he should be focused on fixing what's wrong? Would he even know what to do?
Unlike in the past when Clinton attacked Trump, this time Team Trump replied with more than just a few tweets, deploying a more conventional tool, what's known in the Politico media racket as rapid response. As Clinton spoke, the Trump campaign fired off 9 press releases, along with, naturally, a handful of Trump's own tweets. The candidate then followed all that up by posting this video on Instagram.
Hillary Clinton's only right about one thing. I understand debt and how to handle it. I've made a fortune with debt. But debt for this country is a disaster, and Obama has piled it on, and she's been there watching.
All right, so John, how did Clinton and Trump do on this first day of the new era for the Trump campaign?
Well, let us note that, let's start with Hillary Clinton. This is obviously the second part deux of the attack that she launched against Trump, which billed as a major foreign policy speech now a couple weeks ago. I thought this was solid, sharp, strong. It made the case that she wanted to make. Not as effective, I think, as that first one, that first speech, the foreign policy-driven one, partly because that one had the element of surprise. People didn't know what she was going to do. And partly because I think she is in a slightly more vulnerable position, defending and owning the Obama record of the last 8 years, which in some respects has been good, in other respects has been not what many people expected. So she came across, I thought, maybe a little more tentative, maybe a little less, it just wasn't quite as...
The Clinton campaign wants to make this election a referendum on Donald Trump. I thought for her purposes, for that purpose today was very effective. It gets reporters thinking about Trump's past statements and record on the economy, which is got vulnerabilities, and it also opens the door to what we're going to see, which is some real human beings examples of people who have been have had problems with Trump vis-a-vis the economy. I thought the Trump team, not perfect, but they were solidly researched documents. They were coming out quickly. They were in the discussion. Priority one for Trump's team now is to convince people he has turned the page. This is a new era. Today was a much different way of responding, and I think pretty effective to comfort Republicans, at least.
Well, and it's 100% clear from the reporting of our team here at Bloomberg Politics is that the RNC was basically doing all of this for Trump. They basically outsourced that rapid response, and that's an encouraging sign, too, because there's been a lot of reports of the difficulty of integrating with the RNC. In fact, the RNC was on board, firing stuff off today.
And the RNC research shop is good.
It's good. It's not it's a good sign for them that they were able to pull that together, even though some of the claims they made in those rapid response were a little hinky.
Pretty typical.
A little hinky. All right. Beyond the main event today, the post-Lewandowski Trump campaign woke up to some discouraging data and some sobering realities today. There were some troubling national and battleground state polls, but these were no match for the even more troubling, the massively troubling, the scarifyingly troubling Trump fundraising numbers. Trump's campaign only raised $3.1 million last month, compared with the $25.4 million that the Clinton campaign raised during that same period. Despite loaning his campaign more than $2 million, Trump's team had only $1.3 million in cash on hand as of the end of May, compared with $42.5 million on Team Clinton. In a statement this morning, the Trump camp said that his donor outreach has only just begun, adding, quote, "To date, the campaign's fundraising has been incredible, and we continue to see a tremendous outpouring of support from Mr. Trump and money to the Republican Party," end quote. That statement belied slightly by the actual numbers. So, Mark, my question for you, focusing mostly on the question of the Trump campaign as an operational entity. Where do things stand now on day one of the post-Lewandowski era?
Well, look, this is the period when money counts. The general election, when it's joined in full, because of the debates, because of the conventions, and the intense coverage, they're going to not need as much money or as much parity later on. Now they need money. We should say there were two good poll numbers for Trump. Quinnipiac had him basically even in both Pennsylvania and Ohio. That's encouraging, but that's overwhelmed in terms of this narrative by the fundraising thing. They have a narrative problem on the fundraising because this looks so bad. They also have a reality problem, which is they need to be on with paid media. They're raising money now. The question is, what do they do with it? Do they try to compete on TV, or do they just hold their breath, follow the leader? Trump says this campaign didn't really start to the conventions, and hope that whatever damage is being done now by the advertising, by this narrative, doesn't hurt him in the long run.
This fundraising number is horrific, abysmal, appalling, shocking.
He's got less money than House candidates. Some House candidates.
They're broke. The campaign is broke. The campaign has debts.
Well, but they've taken in money since the report.
They have, but it's not. We don't know what we know. As the time of the filing of this report, which is the only data we have right now, they were in the red to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. Even though they had 1.4 million in cash in hand, they had.
Well, but he doesn't need to be paid back if he decides not to be.
Nonetheless,
they're not in debt to tens of millions of dollars.
It's not a campaign. They actually have. Yes, they have liabilities. Those are real liabilities on their books.
He doesn't need to be paid back.
In any case, they are liabilities on the books.
Yes.
They are. Effectively, the campaign is effectively non-functional. There's no campaign. You asked the question we've been asking for days. Why are they not on the air in the battleground states? Because they don't have the money to pay for the advertising time in the battleground states. This renders this campaign non-functional at the competitive level of a presidential campaign right now.
If they're going to play by the standard rules, they're going to lose. All right. Donald Trump, meet message discipline. This morning, Trump did a pair of classic phoners, one with Fox and Friends, one with the Today Show, where he stayed relatively on message. Occasionally, though, did fall back to his own ways. But this afternoon, Trump held a meeting here in New York with Ben Carson and a group of evangelical leaders from around the country. One of the attendees, a talk radio host from Virginia named E.W. Jackson, tweeted out this video of Trump's closed-door remarks.
Anything about Hillary in terms of religion? Now, she's been in the public eye for years and years, and yet there's nothing out there. There's like nothing out there. It's going to be an extension of Obama, but it's going to be worse, because with Obama you had your guard up. With Hillary you don't, and it's going to be worse.
That is what we call in the trade a Trump classic. What he said there at the top of that clip was, quote, "We don't know anything about Hillary in terms of religion." Hillary Clinton has talked about her faith at times. We know a fair amount about it. So, John, what does that performance say about Trump's message discipline?
It says that he has no message discipline on a day when, again, job one was to try to take on the Clinton economic speech. He finds himself in front of a group of evangelicals saying something that is, again, raising his insinuations about President Obama in a totally outrageous way, that somehow President Obama is not a Christian, that instead he's a Muslim. That's what the implication there is. And again, I commend Mr. Trump to read any biography ever written about Hillary Clinton, any political book ever written about Bill Clinton, or the New York Times in January when they reported a story about an event that I was present for, where she talked about her Methodist faith, and the lead of the story is Hillary Clinton is Methodist. That's the first sentence of the story. She's a Methodist. She was raised a Methodist. She's always been a Methodist, and it's everywhere. Type in Hillary Clinton Methodist into Google, Mr. Trump, and you'll discover all you need to know about Hillary Clinton's religion.
I suspect if he gets asked about it, he'll walk it back.
But again, dark, conspiratorial ruminations that will get a lot of attention instead of the stuff he should be arguing.
He's never going to get total discipline. But I think what he doesn't get is doing this stuff in the context of a general election is just not the same as it was before. No. It can throw him off message. It can create problems with certain voters. And the press is now on this stuff in a way for the accountability, as we should have been more before, for all candidates, including and especially Donald Trump, given how often he does it. This is just, they cannot be happy in Trump Tower if this is supposed to be how he performs.
I've said since the turning of the page that the more important pivot is not the operational pivot, it's this pivot. And today, within hours of the new era, we have him again doing exactly the same stuff that people were worried about before. And this is going to get a ton of negative press attention, and he's going to be attacked for it over and over again, and it gains him nothing, not a single vote in America.
If you look at past practice, he panders. He's speaking in front of evangelicals. He thinks this is what they want to hear. He says it. You cannot pander in a general election when there are cameras in the room and get away with it.
It's actually not what they want to hear. Most of them. Yeah. We'll head to Ohio in just a minute to break down Hillary Clinton's big economic speech. But first, a quick word from our sponsors.
Joining us now to talk more about the fundraising and cash-on-hand situation of Donald J. Trump, billionaire, Spencer Zwick, who I say, without fear of any contradiction, is one of the top political fundraisers ever in either party in the history of this young country. He was Mitt Romney's finance chair in the last presidential campaign, and he now heads Paul Ryan's finance operation. Spencer, thank you for coming back.
Thank you.
So there's lots of talk about how Donald Trump's current financial situation is dire. His campaign says it's not a problem. What is the reality of the current mismatch between what the campaign needs to spend and how much they have?
Well, going back 4 years ago, I remember the month of May was critical for Governor Romney and for our campaign. And we raised about $75 million in the same month, had about $100 million cash on hand. And we knew that you don't get the month of May back. You don't, because once you get into the fall, you need to be campaigning and not raising money as much. And so now is the time to be raising money. I worry that they have passed through the month of May and really not performed that well on the fundraising side.
Well, when you say you worry about it, because you have you come around to Trump and become a full-fledged Trump backer?
No, but I'm a loyal Republican, and I want the Republican Party to be successful, and so I'd like to see the Republican Party win.
You're not where Governor Romney is, though, in his full-throated. Someone who obviously you worked for in successive cycles. You're not where Governor Romney is with respect to Mr. Trump.
I haven't decided what I'm going to do in the fall. Right now, I'm 100% focused on Paul Ryan and his agenda and his effort. By the way, we're raising records amount of money at Team Ryan, and I think we're doing that because Paul is talking about an agenda and a vision for America.
Is it not the case that you have to kind of work hard? I mean, you worked really hard to raise a lot of money from Mitt Romney. It seems to me you have to kind of almost work almost as hard in the opposite direction to be in the state they're currently in. $1.8 million cash on hand. That's less than dozens of congressional candidates, including some who will run unopposed, and they're in the red. So they're effectively a bankrupt campaign at this point. It seems to me you kind of have to try to be in that far in the hole at this point.
You would think, sitting at the top of the ticket, being the Republican nominee for president, that you just could show up to a few events and you could raise more money than that. But I think people want a message and they want to hear a vision articulated by the candidate. I don't think you can blame this just on the operations of the campaign or the finance staff or the bundlers or the donors. At the end of the day, the buck stops with the candidate.
So you worked for a candidate who had a lot of wealth, maybe not as much as Donald Trump, but a lot of wealth. And you've seen this in past with people are saying now, Trump should just write a big check. Just explain to people the psychology that takes over for people who might give once a very wealthy person writes a big check. How hard is it then to raise money?
Almost impossible, because what happens is people say he doesn't care about the donors. He may not want this as much as because he's not willing to spend the time raising the money. For someone like Mitt Romney or Donald Trump, it's easier to just write a check than to ask friends and colleagues to do the same.
So if Trump wanted to self-fund, again, as people are talking about, as he talks about, it seems to me he'd either have to go all the way and be willing to fund the entire thing or not do it at all. Because the minute he gives, say he gave $50 million, would that be enough? It's not enough to get him through it, but would that be enough to trigger the psychology of donors saying, well, if he gave $50 million, he can give $50 million more?
I think it would. I think people would expect him to give more and to turn over the next card the minute he writes a check.
So he's got to either commit, I'm funding the whole thing up to $500 million, or he shouldn't write a big check.
Well, the interesting thing is all throughout the primary, he said, I'm not going to raise money. I don't want to spend time raising money. And, you know, if you look at the May report, turns out he meant what he said.
So you made the comment just a second ago that it comes back to the candidate and the candidate's message, right? We all know that in the past 3 weeks, that Donald Trump has said a number of things that were problematic in terms of his poll standing, in terms of a lot of people in the Republican Party beginning uncomfortable with him, talking about Judge Curiel, things he said after the Orlando shooting. What do you hear from donors who are kind of skittishly getting sort of in some big names getting on board the Trump train? What do you hear from the donor community in the wake of Trump's bad 3 weeks in terms of the message that you're talking about as being central?
I think donors are really craving an opportunity to be inspired, to be led by a candidate. And for many, they're not seeing that, because just when they start to get comfortable, we hear a comment about a judge, or we hear a comment, post-Orlando tragedy about himself. I think Donald Trump, in order to raise money, should stop talking about Trump University and start telling the American people what he's going to do as president in the first 100 days.
So let's talk, your message point I think is clearly right, but let's talk about just the mechanics of fundraising, which you know well. So let's say Paul Manafort and Donald Trump called you and said, Spencer, you know a fair amount about this. What should we do going forward to get ourselves out of the hole? Just talk about the mechanics. Should they be focusing on super PAC? Should they be focusing on the RNC? Small dollar? How should they try to get out of this hole?
Well, I don't understand why the Trump campaign has not engaged a low-dollar community in terms of giving $10, $20, $50, $100. He talks about how he can gather thousands and tens of thousands of people. Why not ask them to give? It might not be thousands of dollars or tens of thousands of dollars per person, but if he has enough money coming from small dollar contributors, it's going to add up. Ask Bernie Sanders.
Yeah. So back of the envelope, because again, you studied Barack Obama, Bernie Sanders, and what you all did. How much could he raise that way, do you think?
He could put, $100 million in the bank that way if he actually put an effort behind it.
Between now and November, or just a couple months?
Yeah, he could probably do that between now and November. But I think the other part of it is he's either going to need to get a super PAC actively engaged or really merge with the party and have the party begin to take over his fundraising. I think they've proven that at the Trump campaign, either they're not capable or they're not interested in raising money.
Well, they seem to be. They're spending a fair amount of time in red states raising money, so they're not rejecting the notion that they need to raise.
Well, if you're going to spend the time, you might as well do it well.
Yeah. He boasted about raising 12 million or so in Texas on this California swing. Were those impressive numbers to you?
Yeah, if those turn out to be true, and he's actually raising that money, maybe he has enough momentum. You have to remember, he won the primary without having to raise or spend too much money. So And largely that's your fault in the media for giving him hundreds of millions of dollars of free advertising. He might become president of the United States without spending a fraction of what Mitt Romney or Barack Obama spent.
Bottom line, Spencer, you watched how the financial disparity, as successful as you were, the financial disparity between your campaign and the Obama campaign cost you enormously politically in these months, in June, in July, pre-convention in 2012. Yes. When you look at the situation now and how hard it will be to dig out of this hole, do you think that it's just impossible, that the disparity is too great to ever really make up, and that the political consequences will be huge for Trump?
Well, I think the month of May was the opportunity for him to, as the presumptive nominee, while Hillary Clinton was still fighting with Bernie Sanders, to raise a bunch of money and to begin to define his opponent.
That month's gone, and so is most of June.
Yeah.
So you have the annual State of the Union address where the president defines the state of the nation in one word. Define the state of Donald Trump's fundraising situation in one word.
One word in his fundraising operation.
Fundraising situation is?
And crisis.
Crisis. It's 2 words, but we'll hyphenate it.
Okay, just crisis.
Yes, crisis. Okay. All right. Spencer Zwick, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And coming up, more of our interview with Donald J. Trump Jr. He weighs in on the deep stakes. You'll want to see that. And if you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can now listen to us on the radio on Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We'll be right back.
Is your business ready to break through? Cohn Resnick, Accounting Tax Advisory.
But if you're like us, you know that focus and the drive to do more will take you places you've only dreamt of. We are Athene, and we are driven to do more.
Joining us now from Columbus, Ohio, MSNBC's political correspondent Casey Hunt, who attended Hillary Clinton's speech earlier today. Casey, compare and contrast Hillary Clinton's performance today with that prior foreign policy speech in which she tried to do basically the same thing on international matters to Donald Trump.
Hey guys, apologies in advance if we're having a small gale force wind out here in Columbus, Ohio, so that you may see a little bit of that. Look, Hillary Clinton clearly intended to follow up stylistically on that national security speech where she really kind of hit a groove, and we saw her become really comfortable, almost being sarcastic, snarky, taking these jabs. She did some of that today in this economic speech, and it was clear that's what they wanted to go for. And there were a couple moments. One time she was talking about the research for the speech, kind of going through and saying, yeah, my staff sent me this, and I looked at it and I said, really? He really said that? And so there were some authentic moments like that. But it's also trickier territory for her. You could tell she was, A, a little bit less comfortable with it, and B, it's harder to have to defend an economic recovery that still has so many Americans feeling like they're not part of it. And that obviously has contributed to Donald Trump's success, to Bernie Sanders' success. And there's just like some inherent tension there, and you could sense that today.
I know yesterday they tried to stay away from commenting on the Lewandowski departure. Have they reacted at all to the new Trump campaign, the fact that they're actually dealing now with rapid response for the first time?
That suddenly it feels like, oh, right, this is the number of emails I'm supposed to be getting from a presidential campaign every day? Not quite yet. I'd be interested to see what Brian Fallon's Twitter feed has to say about it over the course of the next 24 hours. He had a jab or two there. I'm not sure you're going to see them respond officially, but I think you'll certainly get a little bit of chatter and recognition that it's going on.
Casey, is the Clinton campaign aware that Donald Trump raised some questions about her religious faith just within the last couple hours?
I have an inquiry out to them about that so far. They still haven't really talked about it. The reality on that is, her Methodist faith has been very much a part of her public persona, but also her private life for a very long time. And I think we've seen her through the course of this campaign in particular talk about how she receives emails from a Jesuit priest regularly, and how this has played a lot into her, some of the more personal, authentic moments that we saw during the primary campaign, for example, came when she was talking about those issues. So I think they probably feel like they're on relatively comfortable ground, especially when compared to Donald Trump.
And Ohio, as a microcosm of obviously one of the most important battleground states, I know you've done some looking at the balance, the relative strength of the two candidates there and their operations. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So some of the Cleveland plain dealer reporting on this is pretty good. Basically, the organization, Democrats here, is 3 times the size of where Republicans are. Republicans are all on the same page. Brooklyn, the Strickland campaign, the state party. Republicans are splintered. John Kasich hasn't endorsed. The state party chair sort of said not nice things about Donald Trump. So everything here kind of a microcosm of what you're seeing nationally.
All right. Casey Hunt, please get out of that gale force so I don't want to see any wind damage to you. Thank you for being on the show.
Business, call Penn Funding now.
Call 800-838-6211, 800-838-6211.
Yesterday here on the program, we showed you some of my interview with Donald Trump's eldest son, Don Jr., about campaign changes and a possible Trump movement in Cleveland. You can watch that part of the interview still on BloombergPolitics.com. But wait, we've got more. We now present you some additional footage from that extended conversation yesterday at Trump Tower. I asked him about the swirling deep stakes speculation. How's the running mates search process going?
I think it's going great. Listen, there's a lot of great people. I mean, we've met them along the way. We're, obviously it's a complex vetting process, but there's a lot of people that are really interested in this because they love the message. Both untraditional as well as traditional. So I think we're going to be very excited about it. Announcing someone that's going to be great and someone that can really help turn this country around.
Do you either know or have a hunch of who he's going to pick?
Well, listen, I know the short list, but we'll get there.
But like right now, if I asked you to write down a piece of paper, how confident are you that you know?
Well, I'd say I'd be close, but that doesn't mean things don't change, right? I mean, this is a very dynamic process. I think that's one thing we've seen is, the second you think something's etched in stone, it's different 5 minutes later. And so, I'm pretty confident on who, could be, but, again, the process is still going on.
Are you confident that the person he picks, the country and the media on the left and the right, nonpartisan media, will look at it and say, that person's absolutely qualified to be president tomorrow if they needed to be?
I think without question.
Without question, right. So you're a little bit more new to politics than your dad. But almost every answer you've given today, I think Republicans around the country would say that's the message we need. You're talking about changing Washington, not having politicians as usual, about making it about the voters, about Secretary Clinton's record. One criticism of your dad that's come up a lot lately is that when he's out on the stump, he's not being as disciplined as you are here. He's talking about Trump University. He's talking about Wayne Newton. He's talking about all sorts of things. Is that a fair criticism that maybe on the stump he's a little too freewheeling?
Again, I think he's always going to speak his mind. I think he's always a very forthright person. He's always, happy to talk about anything, good, bad, or indifferent, frankly. I think he'll talk about it. He's not going to hide away from all of the things. And so the fact that he confronts those issues, that he will bring them up. And again, he's not usually randomly bringing it up. It's because there's 50 people like yourself in a room asking him the question. They're looking for that soundbite.
I'm talking about his speeches, not.
I think, because of the fact that he doesn't, speak from a teleprompter, and that he does speak from his heart, and he does speak from his gut. He speaks like the rest of us. He speaks like the American people.
Right.
Where, hey, there may be a segue that may not be as relevant, but you know what? It's relevant to him at the time, and that the fact that he's genuine about it, and that everything is not scripted, and that everything is not run through, a vetting process of 10,000 supercomputers telling him what you want to hear. That's part of what got him here, and I believe, that's going to be important for the general. Even though we talk about transition, I think there's going to be some of that naturally, but he's always going to be himself. And again, I think that's what's won over so many people.
Have you heard that suggestion or criticism from anybody, from other Republicans, saying he needs to focus more on jobs, Washington change, rather than...
You hear that from some people. I mean, there's a lot of people. Sure. These days we get to hear a lot of things. I mean, everyone and their brother that I know in this life right now is a political expert.
Right.
And they have a lot less knowledge than even I do at this point. But, so you do hear that from some, and you hear others that are saying, what, I'm just happy he's saying these things. Thank you for calling them out. Thank you for being so forward about it. And, if that empowers more people to speak open and honestly about it, if that empowers and gives people the proverbial, let's call it guts, and there's a better word for it, but the guts to speak about real issues in this country, real issues that we face, that's a good thing. Because this PC dialogue of everyone's great and we love everyone and no one's out to really get us, it's the guns, it's the people, it's the GOP, it's nonsense. And there's a better word, it's two words, for that one. We have to be able to have these conversations, and my father's done that. He's opened up the dialogue to a lot of things that everyone on both sides agree are problems, but have stuck their heads in the sand on.
But that's a different issue, and I agree people are critical of that maybe as well. The issue of bringing up uncomfortable things or not being politically correct, there's a different criticism that I hear a lot, and I suspect you've heard at least some, which is that he's off on tangents.
Listen, I think he'll go off on a tangent and he'll bring it back, but I think it's why he's such a good speaker. People, it's entertaining. There is an entertainment factor to it. I'm not going to deny that. I mean, people want to see, hey, what's he going to say next? And he's speaking from the gut. He's speaking from his heart. They're relevant, and they are issues that can be brought up. I mean, I think he realizes now, and that's I think why he's changed some of it. And there's a time and a place where he can do that, and there's a time and a place where, hey, we're talking policy, and we'll keep on track and on message on that. And I think he's done it well. Again, especially for someone who's been doing this, all of a few months.
Our thanks again to Donald Trump Jr. When we come back, we head towards the emergency Brexit. An alarm may sound, so be warned. Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwait is here to talk about the UK's big EU vote happening this week, right after this.
can promote and preserve the values we hold so dear, like democracy, like freedom, like tolerance. That's how our extraordinary country has always made its influence felt. Not by walking away from the world, but by engaging with it. Brits don't quit.
That was the UK Prime Minister David Cameron today in front of number 10 Downing Street, making an appeal to voters who will decide this week whether Britain will leave the European Union. That vote, that referendum, also known as Brexit. Joining us now to talk about that vote and its implications is Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite. John, watching Cameron there, you've got a bunch of polls recently that seem to suggest the likelihood that the vote will be against Brexit, which is to say stay in.
Remain.
The bookies seem to believe that too. So just give us a sense of whether you think that people are being overconfident that Britain will stay in, or whether there's some chance that there'll be a shocker here.
Possibly a bit, because what was happening was that the Leave campaign was doing really well and beginning to really gather force. And then you had this tragic murder of Joe Cox, the MP, and that changed the dynamic in a really marked way. You had this completely vicious, near-Trumpian exchange of rhetoric before. People were just howling at each other. And the British people seem to be saying, look, we just want to get out of this. We're fed up, and we're just angry about the whole thing. And we think there's a choice between Cameron world and Nigel Farage world, which was the leader of the UK Independence Party. We don't like either of them, but we're grumpy about Europe. And it just seems to be going up. The emotion of those who want to go was there. And then this tragic murder happened, and there was a basic sort of British reaction to extremism. Right. And one interesting thing is that we all thought, people like me thought, if there was a terrorist incident, if there was some kind of murder or something like that, it would probably be something to do with Muslim extremism, and it would be something that pushed people towards actually leaving. And exactly the opposite has happened.
The Remain side, what has been their strongest argument, not for intellectuals, but for the voters?
Yeah, it's a simple, and it's an understandable one, because this is saying, you know, you have a status quo. If you take a jump in the other way, it's a jump into the unknown. And yeah, people talk about the fear factor. That's, I think in this particular case, you know, some of it has undoubtedly been scaremongering, but a simple one has just been, you know, why would you want to do this if you're going to quite probably have a recession? Why would you want to do this if we won't be able to negotiate trade deals? Why would you want to do this where, in order to sell things into Europe, you probably have to accept the same rules, and so on and so on and so on. And that was, I think, the negative side of it, although everyone decries it, was a sort of reasonable campaign.
So the people arguing for staying in the EU are playing the fear card, right?
Yes.
The people who are arguing for getting out, you know, when we first met, the European Union was still about to happen, right?
It was a thing of great optimism.
But there was optimism, but there were always Eurosceptics about the ERM, throughout there's been this undercurrent of skepticism about the European project. What brought it to a head that this campaign to leave gathered as much momentum as it at least once had?
Time. People, the British people sat there, the last time they voted on this was in the 1970s. You know, they've sat there, they're uncomfortable with the fact that Europe's got more cohesive. They're uncomfortable with lots of things to do with it, and it just, especially within one party, especially within the Conservative Party, it just ate away at them. It ate away at them. And eventually Cameron gave in and said, we need a referendum in order to solve this problem. And one issue is whether he'll be able to do that. But really, you know, back when we were there, the interesting thing is in the old days that dreamy-eyed idealists used to be the people who were saying Europe's going to solve everything. Now, I would probably argue the dreamy-eyed idealists are the ones who are saying, if we leave the European Union, we're going to become this free trading paradise. We're going to be like Singapore on the outskirts of Paris.
Obviously, the outcome of the vote will tell the tale to a large extent. But what has the process so far said about Cameron's political skills and about his relationship with his constituents?
It shows in a horrible way Cameron is, you know, Cameron remains a slightly lucky politician. He often gets himself into terrible things and then gets out of them. Assuming Remain happens, which, back to your very first question, we shouldn't necessarily assume that, you know, the basic dynamics are really simple. The old, who will vote by overwhelming majorities, want to leave. At the moment, they're outnumbered by the young and by Labour voters who are supposed to vote to stay in.
And not just
there
the
are
young,
things like
not just the young, but the younger.
Younger,
right?
yeah,
like,
exactly.
You know, middle-aged down, right?
Even you and me.
Yeah,
It's that kind of level.
Yeah.
It's that awful level. Exactly. But and the very young. You know, but there are things. There's Glastonbury next weekend. There are lots of things. It's bad weather. It's got a lot of things which would. You know, I don't know anyone on the Remain side who feels sure about this, because they thought they were doing quite well 2-3 weeks ago, and then suddenly the surge came from nowhere.
So just talk about a couple personalities here that I'm curious about. One is Cameron himself, right, who is maybe the leading voice for remaining in. What happens to Cameron's political prospects if he loses this vote and this historic thing happens? His argument fails to sway the nation.
If Cameron loses vote, this is one. It's very difficult to imagine him staying. You know, if he loses the vote, he's going to get Britain out of Europe. He'll probably end up with Scotland out of Britain, because Scotland is likely to vote to stay in. So it's going to, and he's an old-style unionist Tory. It would be a disaster, and that has been the uncomfortable thing which has been stalking him. The issue for him as well is, even if Britain votes to remain, his problems don't necessarily stop there. But, you know, certainly a couple of weeks ago, a lot of Tories were saying, unless he really wins convincingly, we're going to have leadership campaigns against him. We're going to have. So it's not as if, at the moment, he would settle for anything to get a Remain vote. But if he just squeaks through it, he could end up with this issue which people will say, well, that was an election which was decided by a completely untoward event. We need to have another referendum.
How quickly would he be gone?
My suspicion is actually if he lost, he'd go very quickly. I don't think that's what he's saying. Yeah, days. Because I think you could argue, and you might make the argument, that actually you need somebody at the top to see things through. But it's very difficult to imagine the Conservative Party. And the Conservative Party is unusually, as you might remember, is one of the most ruthless operations in the. It gets rid of leaders very, very quickly. The Labour Party not.
So if let me just ask you about on the opposite side, on one of the more surprising people who came out in favor of exiting, of leaving, is Boris Johnson, who clearly has ambitions that are much greater than almost anybody's ambitions in the whole world. Does Boris Johnson, if the vote is to leave, does Boris Johnson ride that? Maybe into the leadership of the head of the Conservative Party? He's
also been somewhat tainted, because basically most people who've known him for a long time think that he's always been pretty sceptical about Europe, but he probably wouldn't vote to leave. Right. This vote came up. Cameron, I think, was expecting Johnson to remain on the Remain side. Yep. He jumped to leave, and it's a very simple thing, is that whoever runs to be leader, the MPs effectively have to nominate 2 people, and then you go to the party activists. The party activists are overwhelmingly, the Conservative Party activists are overwhelmingly Eurosceptic. If Boris Johnson gets to those last 2, he would stand a very good chance of winning. However, the MPs are generally angry with him for having split the party. So he might not be able to get over that first thing, even if he was likely to win the second.
So if exit happens, who's the likeliest winner in terms of political power politics in Britain?
The answer, which is a pathetic one, is almost certainly somebody we don't know, because Johnson looks damaged, Cameron looks damaged, Osborne looks damaged in the context of a leave. The Conservative Party has this record of picking relatively unknown people, John Major, David Cameron, and plucking them out and putting them in front of people. And that's what could happen again.
John Micklethwaite,
predicting a plucking.
Right, predicting a potential plucking, and a guy who seems to know a little bit about Britain. Who knew? Up next, we talk to Kim Strassel from the Wall Street Journal editorial board, her thoughts on the presidential race, and also her new book when we come right back.
With us now, Wall Street Journal columnist and a member of their editorial board, Kim Strassel. She is a first-time author of a book that is skyrocketing up Amazon. Buy one now while you still can. The Intimidation Game, How the Left is Silencing Free Speech. Kim, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So this is you're positing that the left does something that the right doesn't do at all, or the left does more of it?
No, so when I first started this book, I actually assumed I was going to be writing about both sides, and I went out and looked. But the particular type of intimidation that I'm talking about in here, I couldn't find a lot of examples of it on the right. There are, and they're in the book. For instance, there's a big section in the book on what happened with the IRS and the targeting scandal. Well, one of the first guys who did that when Bush was in office, right after the 2004 election, suddenly the IRS was investigating a big liberal-leaning church out in California that had sort of semi-endorsed John Kerry. And it caused a big blowback, and that ended up getting shut down. And there are some other examples of Republicans just playing shenanigans at the Federal Election Commission and stuff, too.
So why would the left do this more? Is it cultural? Why is it?
So my argument in the book is that the left, whether you agree with this or not, they in particular care about and like campaign finance laws. And in 2010, when the Supreme Court issued Citizens United, and it let a whole bunch of groups go back and play in politics. You can actually see it. They wrote out there was a discussion at the time among scholars and things saying, well, we can no longer outright bar people from taking part in elections, so instead we need to make it painful for them. And in particular, they were talking about corporations. And whether you agree with those tactics or not, they've spread now, though, to a lot of other people, and I would argue to average Americans who've been targeted.
But you were talking about a particular kind of silencing, right? That what's the precise? What do you focus? What's the precise kind of thing that you're focused on here that you think liberals only do? There's obviously, as you said, there's people who try to influence people's speech in various ways on both sides of the political.
So most of the book is focused on things that have actually happened from government,
right,
which I think is very scary. The IRS targeting, for instance, there were about 300 conservative groups that were put on ice for 2 election cycles. They didn't get their papers back. They weren't told they could operate as nonprofits. And we know from the Treasury Department Inspector General that it was based on ideology and was done by bureaucrats. And I think the part that people forget is that in 2010, the year that started at the IRS, you had letters coming in from Democratic members of Congress. You had the president out every day on the stump saying there's all these shady conservative groups, all these Tea Party groups. We don't know where they're getting their money. Somebody ought to do something about this, and the IRS did.
Do you think there's a? I mean, I want to try to take your book and kind of connect it up to the campaign now. One of the most persistent complaints that the Trump campaign and people around Trump, that was kind of saying PC culture, that we have to get past PC. And PC obviously is also a form of trying to influence speech to conform to certain kind of cultural norms. Do you think that the kinds of things you're talking about in the book are part of this broader constellation of issues that's fueled Trump and connected up with certain kinds of voters in the Republican Party?
I think it is, because if you go out and you talk to a lot of conservatives out there, and I have no doubt that a lot of them are Trump supporters for this reason. They feel as though they can't come out and say anything, and they feel that at a local level, in a sort of cultural way, in the PC realm that you're talking about. But a lot of the things that I wrote about in the book have been very scarring to a lot of conservatives out there, in particular those in the Tea Party group. There was, quite a big deal with this Wisconsin John Doe probe that went on. A lot of people who care about free market groups like ALEC, they have felt as though there is this effort to make sure they can't speak, and I'm sure that is part of Trump's appeal.
I read all your editorials about lots of things, and all of them about Trump. I'm wondering how would you characterize the way the Ed Board currently sits vis-a-vis Donald Trump?
Look, I think, well, by the way, the Ed Board never endorses anybody. We haven't endorsed anyone in an election in a long time. And I think our view is that you go out there and you provide as good an analysis as you can of both candidates based on the things we care about, which is free markets and free people.
But you weigh in occasionally. Today, for instance, you ended the editorial by saying if Trump keeps running a bad campaign, perhaps the delegates will open up the convention and let people vote their conscience. Is it possible you all will get to the point where you advocate that?
I don't think we would advocate it, but we would argue that everybody has an obligation who views themselves in favor of free markets and free people to take a look at this candidate and see if he is in fact the best shot that side has for enacting policies, like for winning and enacting those policies in the White House.
The governor of Wisconsin today said he agreed with Paul Ryan Scott Walker said he agreed that the delegates, up to the delegates, whether they want to change the rules and allow everyone to vote their conscience, not be bound on the first ballot. How do you feel about that?
So I think that there is a really interesting point to be made that the national parties, both the Democratic National Party and the Republican National Party, are some of the last big, totally private organizations in the world. And what's neat is that they're not really bound, at least not by any federal law. They do have the right to completely come up with their own rules. Now, the Republican delegates who go there will have to decide whether or not abiding by their conscience is worth the incredible blowback that would probably also come from doing so. But they do have the right to set those rules.
Right, but you guys have been very critical of Trump over a long period of time, right? I mean, in various ways, right? There's no way in which your collectivity at the board. I just don't think Trump is a conservative in any meaningful way, in the way that the Wall Street Journal editorial board defines conservatism.
Look, in many, many policy areas, Mr. Trump's views are not what the editorial board is in favor of. You know, particularly like free trade, for instance, is a good example. There are some things he's come out and he's been very good. Like when he gave his energy speech a couple of weeks ago, I thought it was one of the best energy. I cover energy for the editorial page. I thought it was one of the best energy proposals that I've seen in a long time. Getting him to stay on message and talk about that, and then balancing that out against some of the other stuff is sometimes, you know, it makes it a little bit tougher to cover this race.
Congratulations again on the book.
Thank you.
And as I said, you can buy it now. Kim Strassel's book is called The Intimidation Game.
Not the imitation game.
The Intimidation Game, and it's about free speech in America. Kim, congratulations, and we'll be right back.
Is your business ready to break through? Cohn Resnick, Accounting, Tax, Advisory.
.com.
So it was kind of a crazy day because most of us who've covered the Trump campaign over the course of its existence have never gotten a single rapid response email over the entire year that it's been going on. Suddenly today, the inbox was just overflowing, email after email.
There's not a reporter covering the race who wouldn't notice it, and we talked about how, you know, it was a good sign. I got an email from a good
sign in terms of their professionalization.
Manafort doing things differently. I got an email from a very experienced Republican strategist who said, celebrating this is defining the soft bigotry of low expectations.
All right, that's a good.
It's a start. It's all we said. It's a start.
Okay. George W. Bush, good. All right. Reference there. Check out Kevin Surley's story about the role of Donald Trump's children that they're playing in the presidential campaign. That's on BloombergPodcast.com. Tomorrow on the show, our conversation with two mega donors, Mark Lasry and Howard Lorber, about the state of the presidential race. Until then, we say to you, sayonara.